Hello and welcome back to Kairos. I am Joshua Pfeiffer here today with Michael Prenzler, a fellow Lutheran pastor and pastor of the Adelaide Deaf Community Church. Michael, great to have you on today.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me.
So, we are here today to talk a bit about ministry with the deaf. Michael, to begin with, perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about the nature of your current call.
Sure. So I'm actually pastor to two congregations here at McGill, which is in the eastern suburbs of Adelaide. The Pilgrim Lutheran congregation, which has been here for, I think, at least 50 years, and the Adelaide Deaf Community Church, which is a relative newcomer. They've been worshipping here for 3 years, which is also the time that I've been here. And this is my graduate placement, so This is my first call, and it's been an interesting journey.
Not your average first call for a new pastor.
No, that's right.
And so the Pilgrim congregation is part of the Lutheran Church of Australia, and the Adelaide Deaf Community Church, where do they sort of fit? I imagine they're not part of the Lutheran Church of Australia in the same sense, more ecumenical, is that the idea?
Well, certainly the ADCC, easier to use the acronym, welcomes anybody from a deaf background who wants to worship with us. So from that perspective, we are ecumenical. At the same time, they have a Lutheran pastor. My predecessor, Pastor John Hoopman, was Lutheran as well. So our teaching is very much in accordance with the Lutheran confessions. And also the main support for the congregation, particularly financially, comes from the Lutheran Church.
Sure.
So the deaf ministry is funded by the LCA's South Australia Northern Territory district.
So are there any other opportunities in our part of Australia for deaf people to have a Christian congregation?
Yeah, there's a few others that I know of within Adelaide and interstate. I know that the Catholic Church has got a congregation here in Adelaide. There are a number of churches, such as the Churches of Christ and at least one of the Pentecostal churches in Adelaide, that offer services for the deaf, but they do that through an interpreter. So it's a regular hearing service, and they use an interpreter so that the deaf can understand what's going on. Our congregation is a bit unique in that space because everything that we do is in Auslan, in Australian Sign Language.
So for the deaf from the ground up sort of thing.
That's right.
And so what then is the particular history of this congregation, the ADCC?
So I understand that the ADCC comes out of the Royal South Australian Deaf Society, which was grounded back in the 19th century, late 19th century. And the support organisation for the deaf at that time was mainly run by Christians, and so it was very natural for that organisation to both have worship opportunities for deaf Christians and also provide things like education, accommodation, support for the deaf in terms of finding work and so on. So that's the origin of the church. And for a long time the church worshipped on South Terrace, where the Deaf Society had its own building, and it also included a deaf chapel there as well. Through the years, I think attendance has fluctuated. I believe that in the mid-1900s the church lapsed for a while, and really the Lutheran involvement came about in the 1970s when pastors like Pastor Len Sharkey supported the congregation by holding services for them, often with interpreters. So the ADCC comes out of that era when the church was called St James Church of the Deaf. And Pastor Hoopman, who I just mentioned, took over that role in the 1990s. He was previously a member of the congregation and then became ordained, and so he's very much sort of defined the congregation for the last quarter of a century.
Yeah, so he was he's deaf himself. He was a member of the deaf church. How did he end up being their pastor? Can you tell us a little bit about it, to the extent that you know?
I don't have a full history of his involvement in my head, but a few years ago there was a Lutheran article on Pastor John and on the congregation, and from that, I believe that, he was a member of the congregation. He was encouraged by a number of people, both in Australia and in the US, to consider studying for the ministry. His father was also a pastor, so he sort of had it in the family, as it were. And so then he and his family went to the US for a number of years to study for the ministry, and then came back and did some further study in our own seminary at North Adelaide, and then he was ordained and took on the role as pastor full-time.
Until he retired.
That's right, until he retired 3 years ago, which is when I came on the scene.
Yeah, yeah. And so he was, he would have been the congregation's first deaf pastor, I imagine.
I believe so, at least in recent history.
And so, when did you personally first become involved in this ministry? You know, was it something that you went into your seminary training having in your mind, or how did that whole journey begin?
It's an interesting journey, interesting question. The ministry is my second career, as it were. I was a mechanical engineer beforehand.
Yep.
So I went into seminary at probably the age of 35, and it was probably in my second year, end of my second year, that I read the article in the Lutheran that I just mentioned, and it had interviews with Pastor John and his wife Sandra. It had information about the ministry, and it also had a little ad in one of the bottom corners, which basically said, Pastor John's looking to retire, but can't find anybody to take over. Are you interested? And I just felt God tapping me on the shoulder saying, maybe give that a go. And I spoke to my wife, Gertrude, and she was also interested. So we approached Pastor John and Bishop David from the South Australian district and said, we've got no idea what's involved. We're not deaf. We have no deaf relatives at all. We don't know the language.
You didn't know any Auslan at that stage?
No, I didn't know anything. But we're willing to give it a go if you don't have any other options. And they didn't. So they said, well, we'll give you a go.
Wow.
What can we lose? Sort of thing. And so then for the last 3 years of my seminary training, both Gertrude and I also went to TAFE and learned Auslan. And TAFE's the main provider of Auslan teaching services in South Australia. So we did a Certificate 2 and Certificate 3, and the end of the Certificate 3 course corresponded with my completion of studies at seminary. And so at that point I was then called jointly by Pilgrim Lutheran here and by the ADCC as well.
Wow. And so for international viewers or listeners, or for those who just don't know what Auslan is, tell us what actually are we talking about?
So Auslan is an abbreviation for Australian Sign Language, and it's important to note, I often get the question, is there one sign language around the world? Well, there isn't, just as there are many different spoken languages, there's many different sign languages.
This surprised me the first time I learnt this.
And so, for your American viewers, ASL, American Sign Language, is totally different from Auslan. So it's a language which has developed naturally within the deaf community. It's not an artificial language. And they have evidence of the use of British Sign Language, which is the forebear of Auslan, already in the 1600s. And it was probably around well before then as well. It's just that's the first time it was recorded in written form. And so in the 1800s, when people started emigrating from the UK to Australia, naturally some deaf people came and they brought their languages across, and that was the start of deaf people in Australia. And they started 2 schools, particularly for the deaf, in Melbourne and Sydney, and they both had slightly different variants of BSL, British Sign Language.
Dialects everywhere else.
That's right. And so still today there are some dialects within Australia, and roughly divided along those lines. So the southern area follows more the Melbourne school, and New South Wales and Queensland more the Sydney school.
So is Auslan still more closely connected then to British Sign Language than American, or is it?
Yeah, it's a lot closer.
Yeah.
I looked it up at one stage, and British Sign Language, New Zealand Sign Language and Auslan all belong to the same family of sign languages, and I think there's about 80% commonality between them all. So 80% of the vocab and grammar is the same, and there are then regional variations.
Do you know any American Sign Language?
When we were at TAFE, we learnt a little bit of the alphabet.
So could you show us, for example, this is putting you on the spot, but could you show us, for example, A, B, C, D in American versus Auslan?
No, I couldn't anymore.
Okay.
I've forgotten. But the big difference is that the Australian finger spelling, it's called, where you represent words on your hands, uses two hands.
So show us in Auslan then.
Yep. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc.
Now I've got a feeling, if my memory is correct, is that American is A, B, C, D.
I reckon
something
you'd
like
be right.
that.
Yeah. So it's a one-handed alphabet.
And so I imagine learning Auslan would have been the major part of your preparation for ministry to the deaf. What else was involved in getting ready? So your second year of seminary, you hear this call, we have that conversation, we better start learning the language like any missionary does. What else did you have to do to prepare for that possibility?
So in our seminary, we not only, as you'd know, have lessons in class, learning the theory, but we also have fieldwork, practical experience in congregations. So it was obvious to me and to Bishop David and Pastor John that we needed to have some personal interaction and experience as well with the deaf congregation. So going into my third year, I arranged my fieldwork experience so that I was able to do it both in my fieldwork congregation, a regular hearing Lutheran congregation, and also spend time in the deaf congregation. And for the first 2 years, that really just involved sitting and watching and absorbing, and of course getting to know the people and trying to communicate with them. And then in my final year, which was corresponded with vicarage, I did my vicarage again in a regular congregation, but once a month I'd also attend the deaf congregation as well to keep up that contact, keep up the language practice. And then towards the end of that year, I started to get involved in the services as well. First just signing the liturgy, which is relatively easy because you can just spend time learning it, and then...
Yes, same week by week.
That's right. And then, right at the end going into preaching as well.
And so you've mentioned this relationship between the two congregations here, the hearing congregation and the deaf community. How's that arrangement going for you all, and especially how have the hearing folk received the deaf folk being around and those sort of interactions?
So to answer that, it might be worthwhile just going back to the time before I was called to the congregations. Previous to my involvement, both congregations had a full-time pastor. And Pilgrim Lutheran here at McGill decided before this current arrangement that they couldn't really justify having a full-time pastor. So they made an offer to the district to partner with another ministry. And that was probably around the time that they were thinking about what to do with the deaf ministry after Pastor John retired and after my ordination. And so the district proposed a partnership between the two congregations. That had not only benefits in terms of sharing a pastor, but also during the time that I was learning about Auslan and so on, the Deaf Club in South Terrace, which I mentioned earlier, closed. And so the deaf congregation had to find another place to worship. The new Deaf Club, which is now up in Modbury, didn't have room for a dedicated chapel like the previous building had. So the deaf were worshipping mainly at St John's Unley, another Lutheran congregation here in Adelaide that didn't use their church at the time when the deaf wanted to have worship. So really when this partnership was proposed to the two congregations, aside from a very few exceptions, both congregations really embraced the idea of sharing a pastor. And the deaf also asked me, well, what would you like to do in terms of worship space? And I said to them, well, it would really help if you could move to McGill. That way we wouldn't need to travel around for worship at different times. And to make that happen, both congregations agreed to move their service times.
Wow.
So Pilgrim moved earlier, the deaf moved later,
Mm-hmm.
to accommodate 2 services at 9 for the hearing and 11 for the deaf, which I think is...
Anyone in parish life and congregational life knows that's no small thing.
That's right. I think it's almost unheard of that you get not only 1 but 2 congregations to move.
Yeah.
But they did so willingly and amicably, and it's been working really well. So we have the hearing service at 9. We then have tea and coffee afterwards, and the deaf are invited to that, and some of the deaf members come to that, and then have their service at 11, and then we have another coffee and chat time for the deaf alone after that. So right from the beginning, there's been that interaction, and Pilgrim McGill really just opened their hearts and their building to the deaf and said, this is now your home for as long as you want it. You're welcome. And I think the deaf have felt that, and they've responded to it positively. They feel at home now.
Yeah.
And probably just one more thing worth mentioning is that last year some of the members of the Pilgrim congregation even attended an introductory Auslan course.
Wow.
Run by my tutor, and it was, I think, a 5-week course, 2 hours a week, and it was again just a sign of their willingness to engage. So not only expecting the deaf to come here and adjust to their own new surroundings and fit into the life of Pilgrim, but hearing people are also making a step towards interacting and communicating with the deaf. And on top of that, we've also had at least twice a year a combined service where we have both English and Auslan in the service, and an interpreter who facilitates the communication. And again, that's been received really positively.
Yeah, wonderful. Just wonderful to hear these positive examples of partnerships in the gospel. What are some of the particular challenges for deaf Christians?
I'd say probably the biggest challenge for deaf Christians is the language barrier. It's very difficult for deaf people who are fluent in Auslan and have English as their second or third language to really be able to participate in a hearing service, not just from the perspective of not being able to hear what's going on, but also a lot of what we do in a hearing service is written, and it's because English isn't necessarily their first language. For some deaf people it is, but for many it isn't. Even just reading along can be a challenge.
Right.
So that language barrier is very real, and hence why it's so important to have a congregation which is focused purely on everything in Auslan. Related to that is also, particularly for me as pastor, a lack of resources in Auslan. Again, everything is available in English for us hearing people, but in Auslan there's not even a full translation of the Bible.
Right.
The Bible Society is developing video resources for the Bible, and they're starting to put that online, which is really good. But it's still not available for the deaf to get a full Bible in Auslan. And that then extends to other resources. So, for example, in the Lutheran Church we use the Small Catechism a lot for catechizing our children and so on. Again, it's not available in Auslan. And so it either needs to be interpreted on the fly, so somebody who can read well and understand will then sign it, or even better, and that's something I'd like to do in the future, is put it on a video.
Yes. It's a really interesting point to think about the sense in which Auslan is really the native tongue, in a sense, and even English as a second or third language. And I think sometimes for us hearing folk, we tend to sort of imagine or conceptualize deafness as somehow, okay, I know English, I know what it is to communicate and read, and then maybe my hearing fades at some point in my life, and this would be something like the experience of being deaf, whereas it's what I'm hearing you say is very different when this is for most people from the start of their life. You actually, and there's as with all languages, there's a certain culture then that goes along with all languages, and I imagine and in my little interactions, I've seen some of this with the deaf community, that there's a different culture then, and so it makes sense to have your own community.
That's right.
But I imagine challenging for you then to come into as a hearing person, just to become enculturated and all of that.
Yeah, well, certainly that's an example of one of the things that I had to learn, that deaf people aren't simply hearing people who can't hear, but they have their own unique language and culture. And so I suppose, like any missionary in a missionary situation, I've taken the approach of not rushing in and trying not to put my foot in it, but actually to stay back a bit and observe and see what are the actual differences.
There's a lot of delightful aspects of this in my experience. Like I've had the privilege of knowing Pastor John Hoopman a little bit as well along the time, and he is quite a character, and I think a part of this is a part of that culture, how expressive deaf people can be in their signing, and a vivaciousness to their sort of personalities, even though they can't hear in conversation, and I imagine that having time to actually see the joys within that would be quite a privilege, but would take time and hard work.
That's right. And I think also it's important to note that any ministry situation is not simply one way. It's not as if I'm simply giving to the community, but I receive a lot back, and a lot of the things that you described there very much bring me joy in my ministry, and I'm finding as well that it influences me and my ministry to hearing people as well. So being a bit more expressive, using my hands more and so on, is a gift that the deaf have given me. And I think also probably one of the biggest differences you'll notice about our worship services is that there's a lot more interactivity in a deaf service. People will be involved in aspects of the service, such as signing the readings or the songs, which is sort of akin to our having people read the readings. But we also take breaks within the service to actually discuss what's going on. So we almost have a mini Bible study after the Bible reading. During the sermon, if I ask a rhetorical question, I'll actually get answers back, whereas in a regular Lutheran congregation, we don't necessarily do that. And so there's aspects of that as well, which I really love and enjoy, just the way in which the community interacts and enriches everybody's life through that interaction.
And because you mentioned about the worship service, just for those who have never seen a deaf church community in worship, it really is quite something to behold, because they actually, in my memory, often, as we said, this sign language is their language, and so they'll even praise in signs sometimes, won't they? They're very expressive, and the hands and everything, bodies are involved in a way that's different from, say, charismatic Christians' use of their body. It's perhaps related in some ways, but it's a lot of gesture involved right through the service, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's very natural because it stems out of their language. So if I can just share some aspects of worship which are different for me as a pastor. When I'm praying, or when I'm explaining a Bible reading and involve God, God tends to live up there, and so we're addressing God in a very physical way.
People naturally look up.
People naturally look up and speak to Him. As if He were there. Well, He is there, but as if we could see Him there. And likewise, His responses come down to us. So His blessing comes down to us, and just little things like that enrich worship. It becomes very much a full body worship.
Often when I read accounts of, say, Jesus healing a deaf person, I'll just have them back in my mind. I don't have any deaf people in my congregation. I wonder how a deaf person would hear this, perhaps not the best choice of words, but receive this this story. And I guess a more sort of theological way of asking it is, how do they understand their deafness theologically? I'm curious about this, and I think, maybe we talked about this sometime in the past. That's why it's sitting in my mind. And again, when I hear of things about the new creation, and I think of friends with different disabilities or children with different things. I think, it's just, I'm not sure there's any clear answers to these, but to what extent is this aspect of our humanity part of the fallen world, and to what extent is it part of just who we are? You can't imagine this person without this particular aspect of their personality. Yep. So I guess my question though is how do the deaf people themselves, to what you know, understand this? Have you come across any of these conversations? Yeah,
definitely. I suppose I should qualify my answer with two things. First of all, one, I'm not an expert on deafness, and what I've observed of the deaf community is pretty much limited to our congregation. So what I say mightn't be applicable across the board. The second thing is that as hearing people, as you alluded to earlier, we associate deafness with loss. So as adults who are hearing, if we were to lose our hearing, we would feel that a big part of who we are has been lost. The communication aspect, obviously, but also the enjoyment aspect, enjoyment of music and so on. And so it's important to qualify any answer relating to this by saying that a lot of the deaf people that we have in the congregation were born deaf or became deaf as children. And so they don't have that aspect of loss in their life. Obviously the deafness makes it difficult for them to communicate with hearing people, so that there's that communication barrier as well. But most of the deaf people I know don't see themselves as being broken or disabled. That being deaf is simply who they are, and they live perfectly fulfilled lives. They're able to communicate with sign language, and they can hold down jobs and have families and all the sorts of things we expect. So it's important to remember when we're talking about this that most deaf people don't actually see a problem with their deafness. But at the same time, the question has come up in worship. Whenever we're talking about the healing that Jesus performs, like we're going to hear on Sunday as well from Matthew 4. And so the question then becomes, well, okay, why did God allow me to be deaf? And even more so, why doesn't God heal me of my deafness if I pray to him for it? And in our discussion, the answer came down to what we would normally say within any Christian Bible study of this topic, that yes, deafness, just like other physical disabilities or even just the general brokenness of relationships and so on, stems from original sin and Adam and Eve's fall. And the solution to that that God has given us is a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth, the resurrection of the body in whatever form that will take. And so deafness sort of falls into that area. Why God doesn't heal us now? It's the perennial question, isn't it? Why does God allow us to suffer? I suppose one positive aspect which has come out of our discussions about that is the realization that my members as deaf people are perfectly placed to actually share the good news with other deaf people. So I, as a hearing person, am not fully accepted into the deaf community. It's only natural. I'm not deaf, and I don't take offence at that. But my congregation members have got friends who are deaf, family members who are deaf, and so they, I suppose, are well placed to actually bring the gospel to their friends and their neighbours and their family members in a language that the people understand. So it's not only negative suffering and so on, but there's also positive aspects to it.
Well, thank you for sharing those things. And obviously there's a lot of mystery around, as you say, what this means for all sorts of aspects of our humanity, the redemption and all things being made new in Christ. And as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about is that I often go back to in these discussions too are the scars of Jesus, and so there he is in his resurrected, glorified body, but still with these scars. Somehow these marks are carried into what no eye has beheld, and the mysteries that lie ahead for us, and how that looks like for deaf people is just, we'll find out one day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somehow the marks of this, perhaps still there, and that, this aspect of their personality is, you can't separate it in some sense, but all be made new, glorified.
That's right. It certainly makes me wonder sometimes.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder, well, maybe they'll still be deaf, but the rest of us will be able to communicate in sign language.
Right.
That could be very much the way in which God works.
Right. Because there is just something truly joyful about seeing a group of deaf people in conversation that I've never seen anything quite like it, and just the expressiveness and the dynamism of the way, and there'll be this table of people, and you just sense, something manifestly special about this. So we've talked a little bit about your ministry and some of the joys and challenges already, but I guess maybe a little bit more detail we can talk about that. What have been firstly the big challenges for you in this time of ministry to and with the deaf, and what have been the joys as well?
Starting with the challenges, the language has been by far the biggest challenge.
How is your Auslan now? So how many years down the track are you?
So I did 3 years formal training at TAFE. That was part-time, roughly 8 hours a week during school terms. And then I've been in the ministry now for 3 years, so it's been 6 years. And I'd say I'm maybe 80% of the way to where I would like to be. I must admit that coming into it in my 30s was hard work. And my progress was a lot slower than I had hoped, but by the grace of God and perseverance, I am where I am. After finishing TAFE, the first 2 years of ministry, I just focused on using my Auslan. So from the very first service that I conducted, it was in Auslan, and I'm not sure how much my people would have understood at that time, but I felt it was important to make the effort. And it's gradually improved over time. Last year I had the privilege of getting a retired pastor in to help me with the Pilgrim congregation. He was preaching every second week, which freed up a bit of time for me to work one-on-one with a deaf tutor, and that really helped me to improve my signing, particularly for sermons. So I'd prepare my sermon, and then I'd go through with him and ask him to help me correct not only the concepts and so on that were perhaps not well communicated, but also how to best sign them. And so
I remember talking to you during this time, and you said how it really felt like you're basically writing two different sermons each week. We may think that, okay, it's as simple as preparing what you want to say in a sermon, saying it here and signing it here, but no, it was such vastly different audiences and approaches needed, and language crafting, and the way in which you would explain things, that that's a heavy workload if you're doing it that way.
So the way I typically prepare for a Sunday is to carry out my exegesis, my study of the Bible text for the coming Sunday, and almost always I'd use the same Bible reading for both congregations to sort of cut down on the amount of extra work I'm doing. And then from the exegesis, I'd prepare my sermon for the hearing congregation, and then I'd essentially put that aside and work on my deaf sermon. So generally it would follow the same sorts of themes and so on, but like you say, our spoken sermons have got a lot of idioms which make sense to hearing people but don't necessarily make sense to deaf people. When we're doing a spoken sermon, there's a lot of rhetoric involved. We can often use word plays to try and explain things, or use certain metaphors which again make a lot of sense to a hearing person but may not translate into the deaf context. For that purpose alone, it's necessary to prepare two different sermons, and then on top of that is limitations involved in my ability to communicate concepts. So it may be that something that I prepare for the hearing would work well for the deaf, but I just simply can't explain it as well as I would like. So there's also an element of preparing the sermon to suit my limitations, as well as the different contexts and the different community I'm speaking to or signing to.
Yeah. So the challenges, and what about the joys? What have been the joys of ministry to and with the deaf, and any of them unexpected joys I'm curious about too?
So I've mentioned a few of them already. I think deaf worship is something wonderful. Being involved in whole body worship is something totally different to my previous experience of church, other than perhaps, as you mentioned, some Pentecostal churches where the sense of community is also wonderful. People are always very willing to help other people if they don't understand. So the whole community essentially moves at the pace of the community. So you don't have necessarily people outstripping others in terms of comprehension or topics and that sort of thing, but it's important that everybody comes along. So yeah, that's a real joy as well. And I think also there's a certain freedom that I experience in whether it's deaf worship or Bible study or just community interaction, which is not necessarily identical to the freedom I have in regular hearing worship, and it's hard to articulate, but it tends to be less formal, more relaxed, and yeah, that's nice as well. And lastly, one of the great joys of being with deaf people is just their sense of humour. Deaf jokes can be hilarious, and you can look them up on the web sometimes. Deaf people will put a joke on there, and even though you don't understand the science, you still get the joke. Right.
Can't think of any examples off the top of your head?
No, you'd have to go and look them up. I couldn't do them justice.
And so here you are in the suburbs of Adelaide, McGill Pilgrim Lutheran Church, and the Deaf Community Church now meeting here. What if people want to, either they're local or in Australia, or even if they are overseas, how can they support you, support this ministry? If maybe somebody out there has felt the sort of tug on their heart that you once felt in seeing that little lad, how can people help?
I think probably the first way in which people can help is simply to pray. Pray for deaf people in general, pray for the deaf ministry, pray for me as the pastor, because we are quite a small community. We've got about 20 members, and it can be difficult with such a small group to really do everything that we want to do. I've mentioned the lack of resources. It would be great to be able to get additional support to develop those resources. So pray for people to participate in the ministry as well. And certainly nowadays with the technology that we have, YouTube and so on, it's easier to communicate over distances, so it doesn't necessarily exclude people from helping if they are located elsewhere. And one of the things that I'd like to do in preparing my resources is make them available to a wider audience, so not just focusing on us here in Adelaide, but for deaf people around Australia as well.
So, for example, creating your own videos of Auslan, that sort of stuff, right? Yeah.
So I'd say that's the main thing. Prayer, and specifically prayer for resources, but also, perhaps even more importantly, prayer for deaf people to hear the gospel or to see the gospel in sign, because I've seen statistics where we might have 10% regular churchgoers among hearing people in Australia. That's down to about 3% for deaf people. So there is a real need there for more deaf people to hear about Jesus and his love for them, and whether they come to our church or not is neither here nor there. It's more about them hearing about Jesus and developing a relationship with him.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is another question without notice, but is there any chance you could give us a blessing in Auslan?
Sure. So that would simply be the sign for God. God bless you, or bless you out there.
Excellent. Michael, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
And we are back, bonus lightning round with Pastor Michael Prenzler. How are you feeling?
Good.
So, Michael, if you were an animal, what would you be and why?
I think I'd say a dog. The thing I like about dogs is they're just, at the one hand, so relaxed, but also so full of life. So dogs can equally just sleep all day, and then when they have the opportunity to play, then they just go crazy. And I think that's probably a good model for how we should live life as well.
Do you have a dog at the moment?
No, sadly not, but we'd love to have one.
What's your favourite movie?
There's a few that come to mind. Jurassic Park is one of them. Yeah, just a good dinosaur movie.
Yeah, it captured my imagination when it came out.
Yeah. Also a good soundtrack. I like movies with good soundtracks.
Right. And they're up to multiple Jurassic Parks now. I notice they're still going,
But yeah, the original's definitely the best.
And favourite band or musician?
I'm the sort of person who loves music from a whole range of genres and eras, so going from medieval to modern, but probably most of those that I mentioned people wouldn't know. At the moment, my favourite Christian band is Sons of Korah, a Melbourne group that set the Psalms to music. I first encountered them, I can't remember how, maybe 8-10 years ago, and they've just been really instrumental in giving me an appreciation for the Psalms.
Right. Yeah, thanks for giving them a plug. If you haven't come across Sons of Korah before, they're really worth checking out. What's your favourite place in the world and why?
I'd have to say there's two favourite places. The first one is the Alps in Switzerland. I actually worked for 6 months in Switzerland and had the opportunity to have a holiday in the Alps during summer, and it's just gorgeous. Blue sky, vibrant green, and cool, quiet, have water running everywhere, a bit of snow still there or
peaks,
melting. So that's definitely one of the places I'd love to be able to afford a holiday house in. And the other place would have to be Venice. It's just a totally different city from anything I've visited. My wife keeps on reminding me I should take her there. So
all the best with that. Yeah. Do you have a most embarrassing moment?
I embarrass myself all the time in the deaf
event.
ministry. I'm always making mistakes in my signing or doing something like that. But probably the most embarrassing moment for me, I don't know if anybody else noticed, it was when I was studying to be a mechanical engineer, and we had a subject shared with medical engineers, and we had to watch a video on a hip replacement, and that was just the most revolting thing I've ever seen. It was like, I don't know, a mix between a carpenter and a butcher, but operating on a human being, and I lasted a few minutes and I just had to leave. Thankfully I didn't faint or throw up or anything like that, but yeah, it wasn't nice.
Are there any books that you would recommend we read that we probably haven't read?
Hard to know if people haven't read them, but there's probably a couple of books which come to mind which I think everybody should read. The first is Dr. John Kleinig's Grace Upon Grace. I think it's just an excellent book in describing Christian spirituality and how we can just live our daily lives. It's so practical and down to earth, but scriptural. So if you haven't read it, please do. And the other one is probably C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. We live in a world which is very secular and there's a lot of focus on science, and I think C.S. Lewis has a lot to say about how we can engage with that world. Obviously we're called to live in the world and not be of it, but at the same time we're also called to share the hope that we have with other people. And I think Lewis gives a few good pointers on how we can engage with people who perhaps haven't heard the gospel, or who are negative towards the gospel because of certain preconceptions about science or religion. And so, yes, a book like C.S. Lewis helps, I think, to bridge the gap a little bit.
Thank you for that. Last one. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I think the best piece of advice I was given was at SEM before I became a pastor, and it was simply to be yourself. We live in a world, again, through YouTube and so on, where we see people who are just spectacular at what they do. And we look at them and we just think, oh, I could never be like them. And I think the good news is we don't have to be. Whether you're a pastor or a lay person, you've been given a lot of gifts by God. And so the important thing is not to become like other people or eclipse other people, but simply to recognise, okay, what gifts do I have? And to use them. And I think God then uses those gifts for his glory and for the benefit of other people. And so as a pastor, coming from an engineering background, I never felt I was the sort of person who could stand up in front of groups and speak to them. But I realised that the way in which I come across is me. And it resonates with some people. It may not resonate with other people. But God can use me as I am. And if I were to try and be someone who I'm not, I'd come across as phony. So it's much better just to
It's good advice.
Be myself and let God use that.
It's good advice, and we're happy that you are yourself and that God's used you in this ministry. Happy again that you're on here today. And of course, Kairos is on YouTube just to make it a little bit less spectacular and lower those standards. God bless you. Thanks again, Michael.
Thanks, Josh. Much appreciated.